Good day to you all. My name is Dr. Leon Perlman. I'm in New York at the DFS Observatory in Columbia University, part of CITI, Columbia University Information. And I want to welcome you to our webinar, one of the series of webinars that we have. And this one is on Regtech, or regulatory technology, presented by Professor Ross Buckley. And it's evening now in Australia at the University of New South Wales, where he's located. We thank him for staying up late to present to us. So just some housekeeping notes. Please, right now, switch off your microphone, put it on mute. There's a little button next to your name on the screen. So switch off your microphone so that there's no ambient noise that disturbs the other participants, the other presenters. Please also don't ask any questions via audio at any time, and if you are going to send questions, please send it at the end of the presentation to the moderator via chat box only. So no audio, please mute your microphones now and your video, please. Thanks very much for your cooperation. So today's agenda, very briefly, is we're going to do an introduction to the DFSO, to the presenter, Professor Buckley, and we're going to do about a 45-minute presentation. Then we're going to ask you for questions, and we're going to do two quick polls. And we know that there are many participants who sit together in a room, up to 20 at a time. So if you are near a computer in that room, our poll is going to ask you how many people are in the room, and another question. So whoever's in that room, please just go to a computer and answer the poll. We'd appreciate that. Then a live minute 15 Q&A, and for those who know this, there's an optional quiz straight after the webinar. It's only live for 2 hours, and for certificate purposes, which I'll go into, you have to do it within the 2 hours. If you complete it afterwards, it doesn't count for certificate purposes. So a bit about the observatory, dfsobservatory.com. It's a very dynamic website with a very rich content, including our legal database and the archive of the webinars. This is the team bringing you the webinar today. Professor Noam, Dr. Perlman, myself, Mr. Weschler, Jason Buckwitz, and Nora, who's just joined our team. So these are activities: legal and regulatory database, model laws and regulations, annual summit, webinars, roundtables, publications, commentaries, analysis of new laws and regulations, and close collaboration with all of those in the DFS community globally. These are some of our webinars. We have one coming up on November 1st. Mr. Weschler is going to be presenting on de-risking and its impact on financial inclusion. Then we're going to have another one on November 22nd on credit in DFS, and then I'm going to be presenting on infrastructure security and DFS, on December 13th. So again, about the certificate of attendance, you've got to attend. These are the rules. Very simple. Attend 6 webinars and get 60% for each of the post-quiz webinars that you do live. To pass, you have to concentrate on the slide content in today's webinar. I'll repeat that. The questions today are particularly difficult, so I ask you to, if you want to get through it, concentrate on every single slide that Professor Buckley presents, not necessarily on what he says, but on the slide content, and you'll get through it. So over to Professor Buckley, just a quick intro. Now, he's a good friend of the DFS Observatory. He joined the Faculty of Law at the University of New South Wales as professor in 2007, and his current research focus is on fintech and regtech in developed markets and how to best regulate the delivery of financial services over mobile devices in developing countries. And he really is a global expert on this. I've heard him speak. I encourage you to read his publications. They are top-notch and cutting-edge. And we're very privileged to have Professor Buckley today. So, Professor Buckley in Australia, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Leon, and thank you for the opportunity. So we're here to talk about Regtech. You'll see the slide on the screen at the moment. This is a graph of Google search terms, frequency of searches on Google. The one on the left-hand side is fintech, the blue line, and you'll see the red circle. There's a tiny little squiggle towards 2016. So Regtech is still only rarely searched for relative to fintech, which is the hot topic of the year. But if the graph on the right-hand side, you'll see as of last year, Regtech searches did start to trend upwards. So, you know, Regtech is not as topical as FinTech, but it is sort of getting there. So to begin to understand it, we will move to the next slide. We will talk about FinTech. If we move to, the next slide is just FinTech in the news, Regtech in the news. Regtech, even though it's not trending as much as FinTech, is all over the news. FinTech, to put it into context, which is something I like to do, we've got one major paper on this. Our research traces FinTech back as far at least as 1866, so in other words, 150 years ago. FinTech is the application of technology to finance, the same way Regtech is the application of technology to regulation. Both of the two phenomena have developed in different ways, but over sustained periods of time. In the case of FinTech, as you'll see in this table, the first 100 years of FinTech was something related to the developed countries. The key player was infrastructure, the sort of shift driver was infrastructure, and it had a huge contribution to financial globalization. And the 1866 year is one we picked because that is when the transatlantic telegraph cable was laid. That's when London was connected to New York for the purposes of, you know, instantaneously affecting financial transactions. And that started this first great period of globalization, financial globalization from 1866 to World War I. The next period in our analysis of FinTech is the next 40 years, when starting in, that table says 1987, it should say 1967. I don't know why it's done, how that possibly happened. Anyway, apologies about that. The first period should be 1866 to 1967. The next one should be 1967 to 2008. And the late 60s, early 70s, by the late 60s, credit cards had been really well established as a payment mechanism. NASDAQ was created in 1971. Barclays created the first ATM machine, automatic teller machine, in about 1967. And Texas Instruments created the handheld calculator, which changed analysis in financial markets. So for the next 40 years after 1967, FinTech continued to evolve, but it wasn't until 2008, 2009 that the next sort of shift came. And in the developed world, it came because of the financial crisis. The global financial crisis in 2008 restricted the credit available, so created because banks suddenly had to have more capital and more compliance obligations, more expensive regulation. So there was less credit available, there was more room for startups and entrepreneurial ventures to provide credit. By 2007, the internet and mobile phones in the West, you know, trending towards smartphones, had started to really change the technological landscape. And so after the global crisis, we see the modern forms of FinTech developing, which are sophisticated payments applications, robo-advice, peer-to-peer lending or marketplace lending platforms whereby lenders are connected directly to borrowers, you know, taking banks out of the middle, and the various other sorts of FinTech applications that are sort of challenging banks and bringing more competition into the banking sector, and typically identifying things that banks don't do all that well, and doing them better, sort of relieving pain points in the delivery of financial services. In the developing world is what we call FinTech 3.5 as opposed to FinTech 3.0. The timing was the same. It happened from sort of 2008 onwards. What's interesting is the impetus was totally different. It wasn't the financial crisis. It was really a decision by governments and an awareness of the, you know, extraordinary developments in Kenya, Tanzania and East Africa more generally, with M-Pesa, with creating electronic money on people's mobile phones as a way of getting financial services to people who otherwise have never had financial services. And so there was that role of Kenya as the exemplar was very important, but so was government policy. Around the world, central banks and governments have decided that there's never going to be a bricks and mortar banking network in their country, particularly in the rural, poorer parts, regional parts of the country, and that the way to give these people all the sort of, growth-inducing benefits of access to financial services is to create mobile money on a mobile phone, which allows payments, saving, potentially microinsurance and other sorts of things. So the story in the developing world has been very different than the story in the developed world. This is just another encapsulation of the timeline. 100 years for the first period, which was essentially analog, 40 years for the second period, increasingly digital, and 10 years since the crisis. Moving on to the next slide, the definition of Regtech. The first definition is from the Financial Conduct Authority, and I'll give you a second to just read that. It says, Regtech is a subset of FinTech. It focuses on technologies that may facilitate the delivery of regulatory requirements more efficiently and effectively. This presentation is mainly based on a paper that I've written with Doug Arner and Janos Barbaros, and at the end of the slides you can see a reference to it. You can download it from SSRN if you're interested. We don't agree with that. We don't see Regtech as a subset of FinTech at all. We see it as something much broader, and I'll talk more about that later. But it's an interesting and revealing definition by the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the capital markets regulator in London. So now we move on to Regtech, this application of technology to regulation. If we go back to, say, 1987, what we've termed Regtech 1.0, the beginnings of it was sort of the 1980s. And for those of you, not many of you are probably old enough, but I'm old enough to remember when Ivan Boesky was led off in handcuffs from the trading floor in Manhattan, which was about that time for insider trading. And the way his activities had been discovered was a computer had, run its eyes over trading activity, and it had noticed that there'd been sharp upticks in activity shortly before an announcement with good news. So somebody knew the good news. That somebody knew ahead of time and was trading on the basis of this information, and by a very simple process, checking on the trades that are recorded electronically, that person could be identified and an insider trading application could be brought. So that's a very, very early application of applying technology to regulating markets better. That's the first point there, analysing exchange-based activities. The other thing is we move through that period in the lead up to the global financial crisis, the risk management models for banks had been changed. Banks had their own models, were allowed to develop their own models for the amount of capital they needed to have, and were able to feed a lot of their proprietary data into the determination of how much capital they had. So that was sort of early examples of applying technology to regulation. More recently, since the crisis, Regtech 2.0, this is the first point there is that Regtech facilitates compliance, and pretty much that is what it has been in most markets around the world. So the estimate is that 2008, which gave this great impetus to FinTech and Regtech, the post-regulatory obligations that were imposed on the post-crisis obligations imposed on the banks were massive. And the estimates run anywhere from $5 billion to $20 billion a year. That are potentially able to be saved by technology being applied to these compliance obligations, and to doing them more simply, more quickly, more efficiently. And I'll talk more about why that is so a bit later. But we see that the reduction of compliance costs and meeting regulatory burdens, we see that as except surely the low-hanging fruit for Regtech, but not the most important thing. We think the most important thing is this second point here under Regtech 2.0, that Regtech has the potential to improve supervision and improve regulation. And we actually think we are moving at a fundamental sea change from in how we regulate financial markets and how we regulate banking. And in that sense, fintech is going to sort of necessitate Regtech. As finance increasingly becomes data-driven in the future, for hundreds of years, the whole of banking regulation has been predicated on the idea of knowing your customer. So a lot of the obligations on banks are KYC obligations. Banks are expected to know their customers, are expected to recommend products that are suitable, that type of thing. But in the future, knowing your customer is mainly going to be a product of knowing the data that you have about them. And the data you get from the banking relationship will only be a small fraction of the total amount of data that you are using in making your financial decisions as a financial provider. So as the yellow box at the bottom says, we think we're moving from a know your customer era to a know your data era, which is a fundamental change, a really fundamental change. So, and as the next slide points out, fintech was spurred on by the 2008 crisis. Regtech today is largely a response to 2008 initiated changes, because Regtech today is mostly about helping financial institutions save money, save on the costs of compliance, on the reporting requirements, on meeting their various obligations. But we actually think its real potential is to potentially prevent the next crisis or reduce the severity of the next crisis by helping regulators regulate not in an after-the-fact sense, which is the main way they do it today, but in a proactive, close to real-time sense, which would be a very, very different sort of world. So the next slide, rise of Regtech. Fintech has been a bottom-up sort of phenomenon. I like to say fintech is the result of a lot of people wanting to become the next Elon Musk, the fellow, made a fortune out of PayPal. Fintech is typically characterized by small startups, by relatively young, tech-savvy entrepreneurs looking to make a lot of money. Regtech is more a product of what we characterize as top-down institutional demand. In other words, it's something that the big banks have needed. As I'll come on to a little bit later, the compliance burdens on big banks are utterly extraordinary. There's a lot of money to be made by selling to big banks applications that reduce those compliance, or doesn't technically reduce the burdens, but make the burdens easier to satisfy, easier and cheaper to satisfy. So as I've said here, Regtech's growth is a response to massively increased costs of compliance, the post-crisis regulatory changes that require so much more data reporting and disclosure, and also developments in data science, machine learning, algorithmically mediated analysis, and to a small extent so far, regulators' efforts to enhance efficiency of supervisory tools. But that is what we think is coming in the next wave. Now, in the next slide, when I talk about compliance costs, this slide gives you a very good idea of just how vast those compliance costs increases have been since 2008. After 2008, we've had a worldwide plethora of regulations, some issued, as part of, say, the Dodd-Frank regime in the US, but a lot of stuff promulgated by the Financial Stability Board and Bank for International Settlements and others. And here you'll see, UBS investing, close to $1 trillion in meeting new regulatory demands in 2014, with $500 billion being permanent ongoing cost of meeting the regulatory demand. JP Morgan hiring 13,000 people and spending $600 million in 2014 on regulatory and control technology, in other words, mostly on Regtech, and Deutsche Bank investing 1.3 billion euro in meeting new regulatory requirements. So you can understand there really are vast sums of money being invested or having to be invested to meet these obligations. So therefore, there's a correspondingly large opportunity for people to develop technological applications to do this stuff more quickly, to marshal the information, submit the, put it into the form that the central banks or the relevant financial authorities want, and do it, stop doing it manually, start doing it in, running by machines. And that's largely, as I've said, been the story up to now. So Regtech, as I've been saying, has these two limbs to it. The present, what has mostly been so far, is efficient tools to deal with regulatory and compliance demands, and other tools to help global banks develop centralized risk management, run their various trading books and positions on a global basis in sort of real time, which requires a lot of technology. One of the reasons there's been this lag in regulator uptake, which you see on the right-hand side, is because typically regulators don't have so much money. It's the financial institutions and the big banks are, burdened with regulatory obligations, but also awash in capital. So they've been able to afford it, and they've been the obvious parties with the deep pockets that, Regtech developers would target as a market for their goods. But we think that regulators are going to have to be better, or at least some regulators will start to be better funded. They'll start to move into this space of using Regtech to analyse in real time the data that's coming into them. And that will give them large comparative advantages, and it'll force other regulators to follow suit. I think, so in terms of the next slide, Regtech for regulators, we're moving into this era of big data, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment in the context of the companies we've called the tech fins. But so regulators need to develop the IT capabilities and the systems to monitor and analyse new data sets. They've certainly got the data sets already, they're just not doing very much with them. Cyber security is a huge issue. As the financial industry becomes more and more digitised, it's more and more vulnerable to attack and theft and fraud. And also the ultimate goal, macroprudential policy. Macroprudential is a very big word, which basically means systemic stability. It basically means in the old days, the way regulators regulated a financial system, by the old days I mean prior to 2008, was they regulated the major players in the system. They regulated the institutions. And the idea was if the major institutions were sound and safe, then the system was sound and safe. 2008 showed the lie in that you could have safe institutions that were so systemically interlinked that they could suffer problems. The contagion effects from other institutions or network effects could be so severe that the whole system becomes extremely wobbly, even though most of the players in the system are relatively solid. So macroprudential regulation developed out of that as the study or an attempt to allow for these systemic linkages and how one part of the system affects another part of the system. And that's probably the greatest potential of all of Regtech, to analyse in near to real time what's actually happening across the system as a system, not as a series of sort of treating institutions as separate islands, but actually see where the money's flowing, see where the risk is pooling, see where the obligations are at any one point in time, and see what happens in a systemic, systemic way. So what does Regtech, what can it be applied to? I said earlier that we took issue with the FCA's definition, that it only really applies to finance. And certainly in my country, Australia, it's being extensively applied to agriculture. So for instance, one of my favourite examples is oyster farming in the Derwent River near Hobart. In the past, when there was quite a bit of rain, the oyster farmers would have to stop harvesting because the rain would wash off chemicals and, pesticides and things off the land into the water. The oysters are filter feeders. If the oysters ingest this stuff, they're not fit for human consumption. So typically, after periods of rainfall, the farmers would have to stop harvesting for 5 or 6 days. Now, they only really stop harvesting for about a day or less, because there are little sensors in the water that detect when the salinity, this is sort of brackish water in the mouth of the river, they detect when the salinity is falling. In other words, when the fresh water is coming in from upstream, and that is when there's a risk to the quality of the oysters. And that's a relatively short period of time, and it can be assessed in real time as the composition of the water is changing. So, and the way you do it in a Regtech sense is you link the regulator, the Department of Agriculture, into your information feed. So the Department of Agriculture can see in real time on a computer screen how your water conditions are changing, and then they can see how they can correlate your conduct, in other words, your not harvesting, with those changes. So, you know, another big area for Regtech in Australia and New Zealand is certifying the provenance of food. One of the things we're good at is growing very clean, green food, organic food, or food that meets certain health standards for export to places like China, where a lot of the food doesn't meet such health standards, and there's a growing middle class with the money to pay for sort of clean, green food. So again, Regtech is a technological way of sort of proving the provenance, the origins of the food, the quality of the food, that sort of thing. Healthcare is another one. You know, we're moving to a national sort of health ID in Australia, so that when a person fronts up for medical care, everything about them, you know, every test they've had, every X-ray, every drug they have, whatever they're on now, what they've had before, is all recorded centrally in one national database, so that a new doctor treating an 85-year-old person doesn't have to rely on their memory of what they're taking, which is likely to be very shaky, doesn't have to rely on, you know, little snippets of information, but can press a button on a computer and get the whole health profile, the whole history, everything come up at once. It's not a simple thing. It's got quite a long way to go, but it's where we're heading. All of these are applications of technology to regulation, broadly conceived, that extend well beyond finance. So this whole Regtech thing is, in our view, much bigger than finance, and is part of the sort of big change that's sweeping through the world. I mentioned earlier that Regtech will empower this shift from know your customer to know your data. Regtech 1.0, which until fairly recently, has been about the things I said before, you know, about prudential regulation, about protecting people, about preserving financial stability. But it's been, the important thing is reactive, the third last word there, in the sense that the regulators have collected information, but typically the way they've regulated is they've waited for something to go wrong. And then once they know there's been a problem, they prosecute somebody, they sift back through the information they've collected, and they find the information to make their case. So regulation is reactive, it's backward looking. We think we're moving into a new era, what we've called Regtech 2.0, where algorithms are working over data, are looking for problems, are actively searching for bottlenecks, risk accumulations and stress points in the financial system, and allowing the regulator to, you know, get on the telephone or issue orders to institutions about what's happening, because the regulator is seeing things happen at the same time the institutions are seeing it happen. So not a reactive system, not waiting for the crisis to hit and then prosecuting people for misbehaviour, or in the case of 2008, prosecuting almost nobody and doing almost nothing in hindsight, which is a different story. Not that sort of reactive system, but very much more a proactive system. The other way we think technology will be proactive in the future is that a lot of the Regtech applications will be built into the products. So in the future, we suspect there'll be a lot of financial products which will have the rules built into them, so that the person buying them fills in lots of information about themselves, and the product itself generates a red flag saying, no, this is not suitable for this person, or this person needs to have this particular disclosure made to them before they're eligible to purchase this, or, you know, those things will be sort of built into the design of the software around the financial product. So again, it'll be a real-time thing, not after the fact thing. That, so we are arguing that we think we're in this transition to this new and different regulatory framework. It's really a reconceptualization, if you like, of what financial regulation is. We argue Regtech's not merely a subset of fintech, it's much broader, it has an application in a lot wider range of contexts. It's more than an efficiency tool. It's more than just saving big banks money, although it certainly does that very well, and that's important. It reduces the cost of finance to everybody, but it's more than that. It really has a central role in this paradigm shift, this sea change from knowing your customer to knowing your data, and it'll be critical in helping the regulators use the rivers of data that they have coming into them. And I've been talking a lot about how much data the regulators have. Well, this next slide, Form 2052A, is a very good example. This is a form that in the US, at least, globally systemically important banks, GSIBs, have to lodge daily. They have to lodge at T+2. In other words, they have to lodge 48 hours after the day that it's relevant for. Smaller institutions only have to lodge it once a month, and they only have to lodge it 15 days after the end of the month. So for smaller institutions, the burden isn't really so large. But for the large institutions, in other words, those with consolidated assets over 700 billion or over 10 trillion assets in custody, they have to lodge it every day. They have to lodge it within 48 hours. And the regulator's estimate in the US is that it takes 220 hours to complete the form. The form's 64 pages long, and its completion will take 220 hours of people time, which is, if you think about it, about 35 people working full-time on just compiling this information and submitting it every day to the regulator. So that instance of, and this is just one piece of reporting information, that's not the whole box and dice by any means. So this form tells you two things. Firstly, it tells you the potential of Regtech today to save big financial institutions money, because to the extent you can automate a lot of the assembly and submission of that information, you can save a lot of costs. 220 hours of a sophisticated finance professional's time is a lot of money. But it also tells you how much information the regulators have. And at the moment, they do almost nothing with that information, except in the after the fact sense of trolling back through it when there's been a problem and they want to bring a prosecution and finding the evidence for the prosecution. That's all that is used for today. But if we had software, algorithmically powered software running all over that information, it would, in a matter of an hour, be able to deduce all sorts of things about the information, and therefore empower the regulator to regulate the market in a totally different way, in a proactive, forward-looking way, or at least a real-time way, rather than months or years after the fact. So again, we see that this sort of sea change is happening. And in terms of definitions of Regtech, I started with the definition on the left on the next slide. Regtech is a subset of fintech that focuses on the more efficient delivery of regulatory requirements. On the right-hand side, interestingly, the Bank of England, so the same country as the Financial Conduct Authority, but a different entity within the same country, it sees Regtech as something that allows for a real-time and proportionate regulation that identifies risk and enables more efficient compliance. So it sees Regtech as much more as how we see it, that it's about risk and regulation is its higher order function, and saving money on compliance is important, but it's not the most important thing that Regtech can achieve. And it's not surprising that the Bank of England has the broader, more forward-looking definition, because over on the next slide, what I've called Andy Haldane's vision. This was from a speech 3 years ago. Andy Haldane's the chief economist of the Bank of England. If you have the opportunity to read what he writes and you're interested in these things, you should, because he's one of the best thinkers in the world on this stuff. And he says he has a dream. It's futuristic but realistic. It involves a Star Trek chair and a bank of monitors. Obviously, he's interested in being Captain Kirk at some level of his psyche. And it involves sort of Andy sitting in the middle of this huge bank of monitors, looking at the global flow of funds in close to real time, looking at money moving from one country to another, in much the same way as happens with global weather systems, global internet traffic. And it would allow the regulators to see where the money is moving, to chart spillovers, to see correlations, to see potential stresses coming up. If you contrast this vision of the Bank of England's chief economist with where we've been in the past, when the Asian crisis erupted in 1997, 20 years ago this year, by late 1998, most of us knew what had gone wrong. But it took that long for the World Bank to generate a lot of the data in the World Development Tables and in its other documents, and to see that where the money had been flowing into Thailand and other places, and to connect that to knowledge about what the money had been doing when it had been getting into these countries. It had been going into uses that were not going to generate foreign exchange, which was going to allow the funds to be serviced. So about a year and a half afterwards, we could reconstruct things and know what the problem was. That's not that useful in terms of heading off crises, being able to work out what had happened a year after the event. Andy Haldane's vision is different and is much more forward-looking. And I think, you know, if the investment was made already, we're pretty close to being there. So what I want to talk about for the last 10 minutes is this sea change that I've been talking about all the way through. We use the word tech fins, and if you look at this next slide, fintech is the application of technology to facilitate the delivery of financial services. TechFin is the reverse. It's the application of financial services to the technology. So you start with technology and data. Whereas with fintech, you're starting with the financial relationship. So your starting point is the customer relationship or the investor relationship with the financial service provider. And then you're applying technology to try and improve and enhance the provision of services to that customer. But with TechFins, you start with the tech and you start with the data. So TechFins, it's our little phrase, but they're data-rich companies. They're the companies that some people say will eventually rule the world. You know, Google, Facebook, Amazon in the US, you know, Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba in China. They get the data through selling us things like Amazon or providing technical services like Google or social media services like Facebook, but they have incredible amounts of information about us. And where this development is most progressed at the moment is China. When Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, when Ant Financial, which is Alibaba's finance subsidiary, makes a small loan to somebody in China, you know, a loan of a couple of $100 US, something like that, they claim to be using 20,000 data points on their average customer when the algorithms decide, and it's not a person, it's a bunch of algorithms, decide whether to extend credit to that person or not. And that is partly a result of the fact that China didn't have the established bricks and mortar bank networks. So what happened was technology leapfrogged the establishment of those networks, and because in part the People's Bank of China stayed away from it until 2015 and let fintech develop the way it wanted to, it developed very, very quickly and filled this need that wasn't filled by conventional banking. And in the modern world, the way you fill that need is you look at data. So just to go back one step right to the beginning, in the old days, customers approached a bank, they filled out a long detailed form about their assets and their liabilities and their income and their rent and their expenses, and put all this financial information into the bank. Then they started transacting with the bank. The bank got to know them better and better, and on the basis of that information, the bank was able to extend credit to them, was able to price insurance for them. And basically the organising idea is that the party that knows your risk profile best, the party that has the most information about you, is the party that's best placed to price credit to you, is the party that's best placed to price insurance to you. And for centuries, that party has been your bank. It's the only party that's really known very much about you financially. That is simply no longer the case. These data-rich companies, such as Amazon, Google, Facebook, Tencent, you know, Alibaba, know much more about you than your bank. And they don't know about you quite as directly as the bank used to know, perhaps. But they're able, through machine learning, to run algorithms across the behavior of millions of people and work out, they have this very rich, incredibly complex, nuanced understanding of, where you go, where you are at every moment of the day, what you purchase, what your preferences are, what sorts of movies you like to watch, what sorts of books you like to read, what sorts of food you buy in the supermarket, when you make mobile phone calls, how extensive your personal network is, etc., etc. And across all this information can be run algorithms that analyze the information and compose a very sophisticated, nuanced credit score for you. And this is the world that we're moving into. So our theses, if you like, on this world is that tech fins have their origins in big data. In other words, these data-driven companies start with data rather than a customer relationship. They're a problem for financial regulators because they typically sort of will slide under the radar for a long time. They don't take deposits, they don't solicit customers, they don't handle customer funds, so they can grow very large before they start to become subject to having to get a credit license, for instance. We think that they will probably provide two services. Initially, they will either become the conduit by which people deal with financial entities. In other words, people will borrow money through Google or Facebook or Amazon. The loan actually won't be extended by that entity. Google or Facebook or Amazon will just be the conduit that connects the person to the financial service provider, the bank that's in the background somewhere, but the party that the customer is dealing with will be the data company, not the bank. And this is very likely in a lot of markets because people like these companies and trust these companies more than they like and trust banks. There's lots of surveys to that effect. So either they will serve as the conduit or they will simply serve as the source of information that the banks use. So they already are selling lots and lots of customer information to financial service providers, either in raw form or in processed form, and that trend will continue. So these data-rich companies will be the source of the information and the data that drives the provision of financial services increasingly in the future. This is a big challenge for financial regulation because, as I said, they will largely slip under the radar and not really be noticed, probably until too late by regulatory obligations. And we probably need to rethink financial regulation, and Regtech is part of the answer to rethinking that regulation. Certainly, at the moment at least, the regulation needs to impose reporting requirements on these entities. They need to be feeding information into the regulators. The regulators should be reviewing the algorithms because algorithms can have all sorts of unintended consequences that are nefarious, that disadvantage certain groups because they are based simply on correlations. Often they can breach all sorts of discrimination laws and other things. So the algorithms and the effect of the algorithms certainly needs to be assessed. And doing all of that is going to require Regtech. So as we move increasingly into the world of data-driven finance, the role of Regtech is going to be much, much larger. So to sum up, there's two papers that, if you're interested, you can have a look at. The one on the slide at the moment, From FinTech to TechFin, the regulatory challenges of data-driven finance. The easy way is to click onto that link or just Google the word TechFin and my name, Buckley, and SSRN. SSRN is the Social Science Research Network. If you Google SSRN, Buckley, and TechFin, you'll get that one. And if you Google, SSRN, Buckley, and FinTech, you'll get the next paper. So thank you very much for listening.
Professor Buckley, thank you very much for a great presentation. I think you've covered pretty comprehensively the rise of Regtech, TechFin, and its impact on compliance and regulation. So in the remaining time, I want you, those online, please, if you could, if you'd like to send questions to Professor Buckley, to Ross, send it in the WebEx chat box. Please, again, if you've joined late, no audio-based questions, please. So keep your microphone on mute. we do the text, the questions, the Q&A, and text only. So Michael, our techie, is going to bring up two polls. We just would like to see who's participating, your organization type, and how many people are viewing the webinar. Again, if you're in a room, and we know that there are a room with multiple people in one room watching these webinars, and we thank you for that. We'd like to see exactly how many. So if somebody in the room can please go to a computer as the poll comes up and answer the poll questions, we'd appreciate that. So we're just going to wait for the poll questions to appear, and I should appear momentarily, but in the meantime, please send your questions to the moderator. So there's about 45 seconds to answer the poll questions, and for 1 minute, give it a few seconds, and we'll then continue with the Q&A. And there's quite a few questions already coming through. Thank you for that from around the world. And I'll give you a bit of time now to do the poll, and just also let you know about the next webinar on on de-risking and its effect on financial inclusion. It's a very important subject. It affects remittances, and essentially it's the removal of the ability to have inbound funds go into developing countries. It's a very growing problem, so we're writing a paper on that, and we're going to produce a webinar on that next week. Okay, so the poll is closed. Thank you so much for participating in those who did. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions I'm going to ask that have come through. One is from Sunil in Mumbai. Mr. Buckley, what is the potential effect of Regtech in developing countries?
Well, at the moment, I think reducing the cost of finance, reducing the cost of the provision of services through making the financial service providers able to more efficiently deliver their obligations to their central bank or to their market conduct regulator. So, certainly in developing countries, the reporting obligations on the financial service providers are not as extensive as they are in the West, but they're still expensive to comply with. And especially as we've moved towards more consistent global regulation, there's more opportunity for the use of the same sort of, these are really software applications. There's potential for the use of the same sort of software applications to save the banks and financial service providers money, and therefore hopefully lowering the cost of finance.
Okay, I think I'm aware, I think, of 3 countries, developing countries, that are doing Regtech trials through the RJ Accelerator. I think there's Ghana, Mexico, and the Philippines. The Philippines is doing, the central bank is doing a consumer protection chatbot, I believe, from what I've read. Okay, from Janet. It seems like the rise of mobile money in Africa and the rise of TechFin in China has relied on leapfrogging. Can other markets where leapfrogging isn't necessarily see such innovation? What do regulators need to do to quickly foster this innovation?
It's a challenge for regulators because regulators regulate, right? It's in their nature. And the safe thing for a regulator to do is to pass a regulation, because if there's a problem and they have regulated somehow, they are more protected from criticism than if they've allowed a market to proceed without regulation. But the story of, you mentioned Kenya and China, the story in both places, fintech really flourished in China because the People's Bank of China stayed away from it pretty much until the middle of 2015. And by that point, they got understandably concerned because Yui Bao was a money market fund that had been created on the side of Alibaba, of Alipay. Jack Ma noticed that people in Alipay, which was the payment arm of Alibaba, he created a payments mechanism for people to pay for his products that were being sold from Alibaba, and people were leaving the money in the account. And because they were leaving it in the account, not earning any interest, he thought, well, let's create a money market fund so they can make some interest. And so gave people the option of taking it out of just, non-interest cash and into some sort of investment. Within 9 months, he had the 4th largest money market fund in the world. Now, 3 years later, he's got the largest money market fund in the world. So in 9 months, this, Yui Bao, or as it was called, the money market fund, had become as big as Vanguard and Fidelity and the US funds that had taken 50 years to develop in the US market. So by staying away from it, or actually allowing it to develop and taking the risks associated with that, I certainly understand why the People's Bank moved in when it did, because once you've got a money market fund of that size, you've got something that's of systemic scale. But it was the same story in Kenya. The Central Bank of Kenya did not really intervene very much at all. They maintained a watching brief until it got to a systemic scale. And in most countries, mobile money is nowhere near that scale. So I think it's a difficult thing for central banks, but I think they need to watch it. They need to collect information on it. They need to, do some pieces of regulation, principally consumer protection, AML, CTF, because they don't have any choice. That's mandated internationally. Consumer protection, because if people lose their money, they're not going to use the service. But there's a few pieces of regulation like that, but overall, they need to try to reduce the regulatory burden as much as possible. That's the most contribution the regulator can make.
Okay, thanks to you, Ross. From Ernst, a good friend of our webinars and the DFS Observatory in Kampala, are there any non-bank financial institutions that have implemented Regtech solutions, say in telecom? How different would their implementation be?
That's it.
I assume compared to regulators.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't thought about that. I don't know the answer to that. Short answer. I think it's a really good question. Our thesis is that if there isn't already, there will be soon. In the sense that this is spreading across all sorts of, the technology just allows regulation to be, compliance obligations to be met so much more cheaply, reporting obligations to be met so much more cheaply, that it would be very surprising if this, if it's not in the telecoms sector already, that it doesn't start to, appear there soon. But the short answer is I'm not across developments in the sector.
I know there are a number of startups that are providing at least KYC solutions to smaller non-bank institutions in a cloud environment. So
certainly KYC, clearing customers for AML CTF compliance is a huge opportunity for Regtech, because at the moment that's done on a institution by institution basis. So, for instance, Luxembourg is contemplating instituting an AML CTF hub where financial services customers simply just get cleared once. They go through the process. If they're deemed to be, if they're found to be compliant for money laundering and counter-terrorism financing purposes, that information all gets processed, it all gets stored on a hub, and anybody wanting to provide financial services to them simply accesses the hub, pays a small fee, and gets a green tick or a red cross as a result. And, a typical customer might have relationships with 3 or 4 providers. Rather than each provider having to go through their own process, it's all centralized. Regtech has a huge application in that sort of context.
It's interesting you say that. I was giving some workshops to regulators last week, and one regulator, when I asked the question to the group, I asked him, how do you think Regtech will impact you? And in the simplest way. And the answer was very simply that he doesn't need to pick up the phone to find out where his reports from the supervised entities are. Just that hassle of calling up somebody to find out where the reports was a benefit for him, not even the automated analysis.
The
automated collection. Yeah, it's just automated messages. Where's my report? Okay, from Stuart Camargo, how will ongoing U.S. administration efforts to roll back post-2008 crisis regulations impact Regtech going forward? Interesting question.
Yeah, that's another really good question. Look, I don't pretend to be an absolute expert on US law, and I don't think anybody can predict what the US government is doing at the moment, if they are doing anything. They seem to be talking a lot and not doing very much. But I mean, I suspect that the things that they will roll back will be, things like the Volcker Amendment, and that restricts, proprietary trading by big financial institutions. I'd be a bit surprised if they get into the nitty-gritty of rolling back the actual reporting requirements. Maybe they will, but that's not that's a sort of a bread and butter in the background sort of obligation. It's not the sort of thing that politicians would normally sort of focus on. So I think a lot of the information reporting requirements are likely to withstand something like that, but that's a bit of a guess. I'm not really sure.
Oh, that's fair. Okay, from Michelle in Nairobi, who will Regtech benefit most, regulators or businesses for compliance?
For the next 5 to 10 years, businesses for compliance. In 20 years' time, regulators, I think. But certainly businesses meeting their compliance obligations will be the major beneficiaries, at least for the next 5 years.
And why do you think there's such a lag time for these regulators to implement this?
Because regulators don't have the really deep pockets at the moment. At least they don't have the money to buy the applications. A lot of the applications are not being developed so much for regulators. It's a smaller market, and regulators are innately conservative, so they'll be slower to trust the algorithmic mediation of the data, the algorithmic interpretation of the data. I think regulators will be slower to trust that. Whereas for a bank, if the application is doing what you're doing now, but doing it more quickly and simply and cheaply, it's easy to make the decision to spend the money on it. But timelines are always difficult to estimate, isn't it? I think it's easy to work out where we're going. It's much harder to work out when we're going to go, when we're going to get there. That's always a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Buckley. I just want to end off, obviously, by thanking you for a great presentation, but just in the remaining time, to just tell those online about the webinar quiz link. It's in the instruction email for this webinar. Again, you have 2 hours to complete it, and if you be following Professor Buckley's excellent slides, you shouldn't get to it with difficulty. They really speak to the content of the slides. There are 10 multiple choice questions, and again, if you answer them post-quiz, they'll count towards the 6 that you need to complete for the certificate of attendance. And just again, in the remaining time, just to let you know about the webinars. Again, on November 1, Michael Weschler will present on de-risking and its impact on financial inclusion. And then we'll have one on credit and DFS, and then another on infrastructure security in DFS that will be on December 13. The credit one will be on November 22nd. So it remains then for me to thank again Professor Buckley and all of you around the world for participating in this excellent webinar and participating in our webinar series. And those who are staying up late, especially Professor Buckley in Australia, we thank you for doing that. And for those who it's early morning, especially on the US East Coast, thank you for getting up early and staying with us. So for those doing the quiz, good luck to you. And for the rest, have a good day wherever you are in the world. It's a goodbye from me, Dr. Leon Perlman, and the webinar team here in New York. Have a great time.